Week one of the fantasy season always seems to bring us an immense amount of pain. So let's break down the top waiver wire additions moving into week two of the fantasy season to help ease some of that week one early pain. All right, let's start the video with Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns, a player we talked about in our last minute waiver wire video on Saturday. He finished with 16.2 fantasy points against the Cincinnati Bengals in week one. We love this matchup. 8 targets, 5 catches, 52 receiving yards, a touchdown, a good game script ultimately. Now, I do like Ced Tillman a lot. Sitting at 34% rostered is a player I think that you guys can go out and could definitely be a viable flex option this year. But I will say I do think he's going to be a little bit inconsistent, have some ups and downs, but I mean, for a week one or week two waiver wire player, right? I mean, that's probably what we're going to be looking at. Going to be nothing more than a flex for me, but he made the most of those 8 targets, I would say, in week one. Tied Jerry Jeudy, who also had 8 targets in this game. David Njoku was basically a ghost in this game with just 3 catches. The rookie Harold Fannin had 7 receptions, so both tight ends did see involvement. Then Dylan Sampson getting 8 total targets in terms of the running back who was targeted the most in this offense, but Cedric Tillman still seeing a good amount of volume in an offense that is going to need to throw the football a lot. Week 2, they get Baltimore. This defense struggled against the pass last year. I'm recording this before Sunday Night Football. We'll see how they look. Then they get Green Bay, Detroit, Minnesota, Pittsburgh. It's not the strongest strength of schedule here, although Detroit didn't look so great in week 1 this past week, so we'll kind of find out. And they do get Miami, at least in week 7, which is promising. But ultimately, what we do know is that the Browns are going to have to throw the football a lot. So I like Cedric Tillman. I think he's a player who could be a viable flex option and definitely make the most of some of the upcoming matchups, whether they look good on paper or not. Next up, we have Calvin Austin of the Pittsburgh Steelers coming in with 17 fantasy points in week 1, 6 targets, 4 catches, 70 receiving yards, and a touchdown, and sits at just 7% rostered. If you guys followed the channel this offseason, this is one of my most drafted players in Underdogs. He's always there, the very end of drafts. And I really believed he could be the wide receiver 2 for the Steelers. And although we're, in the very early stages of the season, I mean, it definitely looks like it could be that way. We saw Aaron Rodgers throw the football 30 total times with 22 completions, 4 touchdowns. Calvin Austin tied for the second most total targets on the team. Metcalf at number 1 was 7, then Johnny Smith and Calvin Austin both with 2 targets. And we got kind of a weird mix across the board here out of this offense, and still plenty of involvement from running backs. But I mean, it's an Arthur Smith system. That's what you're going to get. So Calvin Austin, we look at the upcoming stretch, week 2 against Seattle. I mean, I would argue still better defense than what we saw to the Jets in week 1, but it's still a good opportunity because the defensive pressure will likely go to DK Metcalf. Then in weeks 3 and 4, they're going to face the Patriots and Vikings, so it looks strong in terms of the wide receivers. And an early bye week in week 5, they're going to get the Browns and the Bengals right out of the bye week. So Calvin Austin is a player I think could be a solid PPR option over the next couple of weeks. And as long as Aaron Rodgers is healthy, throwing the football as much as he did in week 1, which he looked pretty dang good in week 1, I think Calvin Austin can be a player who can turn into a viable flex option as the season progresses. So definitely depends on who's out there on your roster, but if he's going to get true wide receiver 2 numbers throughout the course of the season, Calvin Austin definitely deserves to be more highly rostered. Very quickly, let's talk about Hollywood Brown, because I know everybody's already talked about him. We've had a couple days, since the Friday night game between the Chiefs and the Chargers, but obviously Xavier Worthy is going to miss time with that shoulder injury. Rashee Rice is still suspended. Hollywood Brown is the next man up, and he showed up in large fashion in that Friday night game against the Chargers. 16 targets, 10 catches, 99 receiving yards, and 19.9 fantasy points. Tough matchup this week against the Eagles, but ultimately Hollywood Brown, if he's going to get this type of volume, is a player that needs to be rostered. He's sitting just 31% rostered until we see Xavier Worthy back on the field and or Rashee Rice back on the field. Hollywood Brown is going to be a player worth owning 110%. I think it's worth noting that Juju Smith-Schuster had an okay day in week 1 as well. 5 targets, 5 catches, 55 receiving yards, 10.5 total fantasy points. Then Tyquan Thornton had 6.1 fantasy points. Ultimately, the player that I would be the most comfortable in rostering would be Hollywood Brown. I think the best wide receiver out of this bunch as well. So don't need to break this one down extensively because we already talked about it the past couple of days, and you guys have probably already heard enough about this, but Hollywood Brown definitely worth a waiver addition moving into week 2. In that same breath, let's mention Quentin Johnston sitting at 9% rostered, who had 24.9 fantasy points in week 1, 7 targets, 5 catches, 79 receiving yards, and 2 total touchdowns. Now listen, if Keenan Allen is out there and available, who sits at 60% rostered, he's absolutely worth rostering, probably over every single player that we talked about today, but a little bit too high for me to really want to spend a ton of time on the video. But he had 10 targets, 7 catches, 68 receiving yards, a touchdown, 19.8 fantasy points. Keenan Allen, another player that we talked a lot about throughout the course of the offseason. I think that he should have just been rostered in most leagues in the first place, but if Allen's out there, pick him up. If not, Quentin Johnston, who I do think once again will be a bit sporadic, is still worth rostering if the Chargers are going to throw as much as they did in week 1, 34 passing attempts for Justin Herbert. And we really saw the ball spread around nicely between Keenan Allen, Ladd McConkey, and Quentin Johnston. So it may be kind of dependent on game script because, the Chiefs really shut down the run in week 1 for the most part. But ultimately, Quentin Johnston worth the upside as a flex option, even if he's a player who's primarily on your bench. Could be a player based on softer matchups who I think we could see some nice fantasy outings out of. But once again, heard a lot about the Chiefs and Chargers, I'm sure, over the past couple of days. So let's move along to the next player. That'll be Rondell Robinson of the New York Giants, who had 11.5 fantasy points in week 1, sitting at just 23% rostered. And I do kind of feel like Robinson is one of these players who kind of just lives in like the 10, 11 point mark in full PPR formats, but it's worth noting here. I mean, Malik Neighbors had 12 targets, Robinson had 8, and then you kind of look across the board, there really is nobody else to talk about. Like Theo Johnson at the tight end position had 3 total targets. I mean, it wasn't a great day throwing the football by any stretch. Russell Wilson was 17 of 37 on the day with no touchdowns, but Robinson is getting wide receiver 2 type volume, whatever that may be in this offense. And he gets a good matchup against the Cowboys in week 2. So if you find yourself in desperation territory for a flex option this week, he's lowly rostered. It's a good matchup this week. And he was easily the second most targeted player on this team in week 1. So Robinson, not my favorite option, but definitely an option in week 2. All right, I am recording this obviously before Monday Night Football, so I'm just going to quickly mention Adam Thielen. Really, regardless of how he plays in week 1 against the Bears, he gets 2 really strong matchups over the next 2 weeks when we know Jordan Addison will still be serving his suspension. Going to get the Falcons in week 2, then the Bengals in week 3. So especially if Thielen has a nice week 1 performance against the Bears, I think is going to be worth a higher roster percentage than what he just sits at right now at 50% rostered. But ultimately, if you find yourself struggling, especially in full PPR formats, regardless of how Thielen plays or doesn't play in week 1, 2 good matchups coming up in the next 2 weeks against the Falcons and the Bengals, and is a player that is still sitting at just 50% rostered. So once again, if you find yourself in bad territory, the next 2 weeks bring really promising matchups for Adam Thielen. So we'll see how he does in Monday Night Football, but wanted to make sure he's on your guys' radars just due to the upcoming matchups. Moving to the running back position, let's take a look at Dylan Sampson, who had a big week 1 performance. We talked about Dylan Sampson a lot this past week, and the primary focus for me when it came to Dylan Sampson was a pass catching role. And sure, there's plenty I got wrong in week 1. There's some things I got right, and that's how it goes every single week. There's going to be stuff that we hit on and stuff that we don't hit on, but 8 targets, 8 catches, 64 receiving yards for Dylan Sampson, 17.3 fantasy points. Now, we do know Quentin Junkins is kind of looming around and has a very strong chance to play in week 2. I think most people believe he will play in week 2. And when we look at what Jerome Ford did in week 1, 6 rushing attempts, 8 rushing yards, 1 catch for -3 yards, 1.5 fantasy points. I think that the Browns will do whatever they can to get Quentin Junkins on the field. But once again, I do believe that Dylan Sampson can retain that pass catching role. He only had 2.4 yards per carry off of 12 rushing attempts, but in game scripts where the Browns are forced to throw the football, which could be a lot of games this year, and especially week 2 against a strong team like Baltimore. Dylan Sampson can still have strong fantasy value, and what is ultimately probably still going to be an RB by committee whenever Jenkins is playing or not playing, right? But ultimately, Jenkins will probably take over Jerome Ford's role, and Sampson can still be very heavily utilized in the passing game. So I still think he has good fantasy relevancy for that reason. So he sits at 52% rostered. This is a player that, even if you're just adding him to your bench, I think has a lot of upside as the season will start to progress. And I do want to mention Braylon Allen as well, who sits at 54% rostered. Walked away with just 6.9 fantasy points, but he did score a touchdown. It was nice to kind of see some of that goal line usage. I mean, Breece Hall had a monster day, 16.5 fantasy points. I mean, maybe not a monster day, but a very good day. 19 rushing attempts. A monster day in regards to rushing attempts versus Braylon Allen's rushing attempts. Like I said, 19 rushing attempts, 107 yards, 4 targets, 2 catches for Breece Hall. And I still think that there is some type of likelihood that Braylon Allen will get involvement in this offense. So a strong handcuff. I don't want to call him anything more than that right now. Handcuff who has maybe some goal line usage, but to at least see him score a touchdown felt good. Like there's going to be some sort of involvement as the next few weeks go on. It's an okay matchup here in week 2 against Buffalo. So Braylon Allen might not be more than just a handcuff stash, but I think, if you're hurting at running back going into the early weeks of the season, Braylon Allen is still a player to keep on your radar because this Jets offense does want to run the football first and foremost. Fields had 12 rushing attempts. Breece Hall had 19 and Allen had 6. And if you watch this game, this offense was essentially flowing through the run game first and foremost. So Allen still worth keeping an eye on for sure. All right, let's look at our top streaming candidates at quarterback and tight end that you guys can target on the waiver wire. Starting with Justin Herbert, I know he's sitting at 87% rostered, but he was available in more leagues than I'm comfortable with. If he's out there and available, he needs to be picked up. 27.9 fantasy points in week 1. 25 of 34, 318 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 32 yards on the ground. Gets the Raiders in week 2. Then the Broncos, not great there, but then the Giants, Commanders, the Dolphins, the Colts, the Vikings. This is a strong opening strength of schedule for Justin Herbert. And if the Chargers are going to throw the football this much this year, we need to be starting Justin Herbert in fantasy. So if Herbert's out there, that's all I'm going to say. Pick him up. I know for a lot of you guys, you won't be able to. We talked a lot about Justin Fields this past week. I was very worried about Justin Fields in week 1. I don't think I recommended him as a start anywhere. I thought this game would be a lot more defensive, and man, he showed up. 29.5 fantasy points, 2 rushing touchdowns, 48 yards on the ground, threw a touchdown, 218 total passing yards, and an absolute dot to Garrett Wilson, by the way. Didn't end up winning the game, but we don't care about that. We just care about fantasy. And the next couple weeks are a lot stronger for Fields. The Bills, the Bucks, the Dolphins, the Cowboys. I think he could be just as good in the next couple weeks. He sits at 60% rostered, should be a top waiver priority at the quarterback position if you need help. Then Michael Penix sits at 35% rostered, had a good week 1 matchup against the Bucks, came through with 24 fantasy points, a rushing touchdown, 21 yards on the ground, 298 passing yards, and a passing touchdown. We'll get the Vikings, the Panthers, and the Commanders before an early week 5 bye. I like Michael Penix as a streaming option over the next couple weeks, who maybe has some nice rushing upside as well. And let's not forget about old man Rodgers. He came through in week 1 with 25.6 fantasy points, was 22 of 30, 4 passing touchdowns, 244 passing yards. We talked about this schedule a little bit earlier. Seattle, New England, Minnesota before an early week 5 bye, then the Browns and the Bengals. Listen, I'm not saying Rodgers is going to have over 20 fantasy points or 25 fantasy points every week, but he will be streamable, and he sits at just 19% rostered. Then last but not least, I will talk about Geno Smith. He was good enough in week 1 with 18 fantasy points, 362 passing yards through the air, a touchdown, a pick, 24 or 34. I kind of would favor the Chargers in week 2 in this matchup, but the Chargers were only so good against the Chiefs in week 1. I think that Geno Smith is going to be a true streaming quarterback, and that's it. So this would be if you're in like desperation territory, like you drafted Trevor Lawrence and you picked up Bryce Young as your streaming option, like you're kind of worried about your quarterback room. Geno Smith is an option. And we are forgetting somebody, aren't we? Listen, I'm not going to say Daniel Jones is a streaming option just yet. He sits at 10% rostered. It's a tough stretch the next 3 weeks, looking at how defenses played in week 1. He's going to get the Denver Broncos, then he's at Tennessee, at the Rams. Listen, I hope that I am proven wrong here. It was a great performance in week 1 with 29 fantasy points. But unless you're in a super flex or double quarterback league, I don't think we need to be touching Daniel Jones right now. I'm not saying that it can't happen, but this is a pretty tough overall. I mean, if you look a little bit further, right? Denver, Tennessee, the Rams, the Raiders, the Cardinals, the Chargers, the Titans, the Steelers. Really the only matchup in there that I would feel okay with is the Raiders and then maybe the Cardinals. But like ultimately, I'm just staying away from Daniel Jones. Let's give him his props for week 1, but I'm not going to call him a streaming candidate just yet. Then we move to the tight end position. I did think Jonnu Smith was kind of disrespected at the end of draft season, especially when Arthur Smith loves this guy. He had 6 targets, 5 catches, 15 receiving yards, and did score a touchdown, so 12.5 total fantasy points. He's an option if you are in the streaming boat at the tight end position. A lot of these guys will be touchdown dependent. If he didn't score the touchdown, we wouldn't even be talking about him. Probably the same as Zach Ertz. 5 targets, 3 catches, a touchdown, 26 receiving yards, 11.6 fantasy points, 49% rostered. Zach Ertz will be kind of a top of the list probably every week when it comes to streaming tight end options, but he's certainly a good option. And Hunter Henry is a player I talked a lot about. I mean, we looked to last week's streaming options at tight end. Top options we laid out were Ertz, Henry, and Brenton Strange, who are still all on today's list. But Hunter Henry, 10.6 fantasy points, 8 targets, 4 catches, 66 receiving yards. Him and Drake May have a good chemistry. Henry is an option. When it comes to streaming tight ends, we may not get a ton of upside here, but these guys will at least maybe get you over the hump. Brenton Strange finished with exactly 9.9 fantasy points. He sits at 29% rostered, caught all 4 of his targets for 59 total yards, gets a good matchup against the Bengals in week 2. And then we got Juwan Johnson. I mean, I will say I was a little surprised by this one. I mean, Johnson's a talented player, but if he's going to get 11 targets on a weekly basis from Spencer Rattler, then we absolutely need to consider him. I mean, he was second on this team in total targets, only to Chris Olave in week 1. And Chris Olave is, already banged up. So Juwan Johnson had a chance to catch the potential game-tying touchdown in this game as well and have an even better stat line. But 11 targets, 8 catches, 76 receiving yards, 15.6 fantasy points. He's just 5% rostered. It's a desperation move, but a player certainly worth keeping an eye on. Then the rookie tight end for the Browns, Harold Fannin, who faced the Bengals in week 1 and maybe took some of the magic away from what was supposed to be a big week for David Njoku in week 1. He had 9 targets, 7 catches, 63 receiving yards, 13.6 fantasy points in week 1. He sits at just 6% rostered. Once again, I don't want to overreact to week 1 when we look at a rookie tight end necessarily, but definitely a player that we want to keep on our waiver radars as we approach week 2. To do it for today's video, there are all of your waiver wire must-adds at every single position for week 2 of the 2025 fantasy football season. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long: free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. So if you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. But most importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop them in the comments down below. Anything that you guys need, waiver wire questions, trade questions, start sits, roster reviews, whatever it is for week 2 this season, let me know. I'll answer every single comment on this video. When the videos do pop up, the playlist on the screen, make sure you guys are checking them out, because as the week progresses, we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need for week 2 of the fantasy season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.